What would you do in the name of democracy? Would you enter another sovereign nation in the name of democracy? Would you steal another nation's oil in the name of democracy? Would you overthrow a democratically elected leader in the name of democracy? In essence, would you destroy democracy in the name of democracy? According to US President Eisenhower and UK Prime Minister Churchill, the answer is yes.
For the first time now, the CIA has released documents that show its role in the 1953 coup.
We had some involvement with overthrowing a democratically elected regime in Iran.
Iran had been one of the two pillars of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and this was a tremendous loss.
Operation Ajax was a coup done by America's CIA and Britain's MI6 to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran in 1953. Operation Ajax reversed decades of democratic progress in Iran by exploiting the nation's unstable constitution, Britain's long-standing involvement, and a rise in interventionist world leaders. This is the story of how that was accomplished. Before we get into the operation that ended democracy in Iran, we need to talk about how democracy started, because the democratic experiment didn't last that long. It only started in 1905 with the Constitutional Revolution, where basically enough people were fed up with the fact that there was a monarch with unlimited power, so they decided to create the Persian Constitution. Now, this constitution has 51 articles and 107 amendments, but I think there are 5 really important ones that sort of encapsulate what this constitution's all about. Article 1 establishes a parliament, which was way more expansive than just the king they had before. Article 51 talks about how the king has to uphold the constitution, and if not, people have the right to overthrow the king. Amended Article 7 talks about how the constitution can't be suspended at all unless amended. Amendment Article 8 talks about how everyone in the Persian Empire, which became Iran, enjoy all equal rights. And Amendment Article 27 splits up the government into a legislative, judicial, and executive branch. Overall, this is promising. So while the Constitution itself was created in 1906, the whole revolution lasted from 1905 to 1911, in which time a new Shah, which is the king of Iran, was instated in 1907 and promptly kicked out by pro-constitution's forces in 1909 because he wasn't upholding the Constitution. Win for democracy. He tried returning from Russia in 1911, and he actually made it into Iran, but he got kicked out again, promptly ending the Constitutional Revolution. What didn't end with the Constitutional Revolution, though, was the Qajar dynasty. In 1909, Ahmad Shah Qajar, only age 11 at the time, ended up becoming the last Shah Qajar. He was mainly a lame duck, meaning he didn't really do all that much, and allowed foreign nations to use Iran in World War I and the interwar period. He ended up going on vacation in 1923 because he was so unpopular, and was eventually formally kicked out by the parliament in 1925. So this doesn't mean everything's looking up for Iran, right? Shahs are getting kicked out for not being constitutional, people are actually fighting and using their liberties, and well, there's no way that guy can be good for democracy. Okay, time for a new leader. Reza Shah worked under Ahmad Shah in many governmental positions until he eventually threw a coup in 1921, overtaking Ahmad Shah, making him basically useless. This is what led to his vacation 2 years later. He was officially voted in the Shah in 1925 and was meant to reinvigorate Iran, make it more national, make it more, well, autocratic. He also had a much harder approach to foreign intervention. Something I didn't mention earlier was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was created in 1909, which was a way for Britain to get more oil out of Iran. This was later changed to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, but same thing. Regardless, Reza Shah put restrictions on how much the British could actually take from Iran. He also did other more nationalistic things, such as changing the name from Persia to Iran, and acted overall much more as an authoritarian than any other Shah under the constitution in his time. However, what really put him in his place was World War II. At the end of the day, Iran was nowhere near a superpower the way that the Soviet Union or Britain was, so the second that those two countries wanted to use Iran, they would. In the summer of 1941, when Nazi Germany finally reached the Soviet Union, the Soviets and the Brits decided they needed Iran's railroads to make sure they're able to transfer weapons and other equipment to each other. Therefore, they commandeered almost all of Iran's railroads. This is a map posted in the US in 1941 of what Britain and the Soviets took over. Here's a more glamorized image to make it easier to read. The British especially didn't like Reza Shah because of all the anti-British oil-related businesses he did in earlier decades, so they made sure to promptly kick him out of Shah. Yep, the British could just do that. Although this wasn't the intended effect, as the Soviets and the Brits couldn't care less what happened in Iran, it ended up bringing about more democracy because the Shah was weakened, therefore the parliament was able to step up and take more control. And remember, the parliament is run by the people. Therefore, the people could have more of a say of what happened in Iran, despite the occupation by the Brits and the Russians. The occupation of the Brits and the Soviets wouldn't even be that much of a headache, as the Allies agreed to exit Iran fully in March 1946 after the war ended. The Brits did it within a couple days, yay for them. The Soviets did take a couple months, and it did lead to Iran's first ever complaint to the UN, but they eventually left, and Iran was now left in a place of more democracy, less authoritarianism, and more control over what they do with their country. Overall, it seems like it's going to be a really great period for... Good things don't last for too long, don't they? Yes, the Shah was shot at in 1949, but it would only be one of many political assassination attempts at the time. It all led to more political instability until the operation in 1953. Another political figure who was rising to prominence in this time was Mohammad Mossadegh, who eventually became popular enough to be voted in as prime minister by the parliament in April 1951. He was voted in a vote of 79 to 12, and he was in support of a lot of policies that were passed in the early 1950s, such as auditing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to ensure that Iranians were paid fairly, as that oil company was controlled by the British still, and eventually nationalizing the Iranian oil in March 1951, 1 month before he became prime minister, to officially kick out the Brits because they refused to be audited. The two-pack punch that Britain was getting eventually led it to completely boycott all Iranian oil because of new Prime Minister Mossadegh, as well as the fact that the oil was all nationalized. However, this wasn't going to lead to the coup on its own, because US President Truman and UK Prime Minister Attlee were both very non-interventionalist. In fact, Truman was especially worried about the precedent that it would set for the newly founded CIA if they were to immediately go regime change a completely different country. If anything, behind the scenes, Truman seemed to be showing more support to Prime Minister Mossadegh than his enemy, the Shah of Iran. However, times change, and UK Prime Minister Churchill was re-elected in October 1951, and US President Eisenhower was inaugurated in January 1953. These two together were much more interventionalist, and almost immediately after the inauguration of Eisenhower, began planning Operation Ajax. The first attempt occurred on August 15, 1953, where both the US and the UK sent in troops to attempt to cause a riot to lead to the downfall of the Prime Minister. However, it failed, and the Shah was actually so scared about Prime Minister backlash that he actually fled to Baghdad and then Rome and hid out there for a couple of days. But the Shah was missing a lot of confidence the CIA and the MI6 had. A lot of internal messaging in the CIA showed they were actually really prepared for a second strike and thought this first attempt failing was actually a good thing. This attack really deteriorated the political stability in Iran. The events of this weekend are unlikely to provoke any revival of enthusiasm for Mossadegh's regime. We are ready for a second attempt. And that second attempt was a success. There's no declassified exchanges between the MI6 and the CIA, so we don't know how it really went down, but we do know they used a lot of street violence and military force while still not directly tying back to the US and the UK that led to the toppling of Mossadegh. This led to the US and the UK, first of all, giving a call to the Shah to let him know he can come back from Italy, and giving him full autocratic rule, therefore ending literally half a century of trying to climb towards a more democratic Iran. This marked a sad reform and a sharp turning point away from the progress of the last half century. It ended the only democratic experiment Iran ever had, and paved the way for its eventual 1979 revolution, turning Iran from an autocracy to an Islamic fundamentalist regime. So when you hear stories of liberal nations suspending democracy in the modern era, whether it be Venezuela 20 years ago or the United States now, consider Operation Ajax. Consider all the work towards liberation that was done just for a shift into oligarchy. And question if it is right to use the mask of freedom to take control away from the people. Question if it is right to destroy democracy in the name of democracy.